Working as part of a team can be an incredible thing. High-performing teams collaborate well, trust each other, and are able to be creative, innovative, and successful. But as many of us have experienced in our own work, teamwork can be fragile. As leaders, it's hard to help our groups become and continue to be high-performing teams, even in normal circumstances where we can see each other every day and we can really spend time focusing on our work together. And now, of course, our work conditions have shifted. This pandemic has caused a lot of upheaval in our everyday lives. In addition to the massive impact on public health, it's changed the way we do work. Many of us are now working remotely, and things that we became used to doing in our normal lives now have to be adjusted using online tools. This is a big change, even for folks who have good access to technology and know how to use different tools. So, how do we foster effective teamwork online? I'm Laura Black. I'm a professor in communication studies at Ohio University. I study groups, and my research examines things like leadership, decision-making, and conflict management. And as a communication scholar, I look closely at what people say while they're working in the groups and what kind of structures or tools groups can use to help make their processes better. So in this brief session, I'll provide some tips for working collaboratively and building teamwork in online groups. There's been a vast amount of research on virtual teams over the past 2 decades. These studies highlight both the challenges and the potential for online collaboration. So today, I'm going to talk to you about 3 keys for effective teamwork in an online group. First, absolutely, the most important aspect of your team is your people. Even if you're working online, the people are the most important. So effective teams have a supportive group climate where people trust each other, feel safe to speak up, and are able to share ideas. Trust is harder in online groups. Research on virtual teams has shown that groups can struggle to develop trust if they're only working online. But that trust is bolstered if the team met face-to-face even once during their early time in their collaboration. So that's great news for us, right? Groups who have previous relationships from working together in face-to-face settings have usually developed trust and understanding for each other. So we can build on that understanding we already have, but we should not take it for granted. So what does that mean for you? It means leaders working with online groups need to build and nurture relationships in a way that's genuine and makes sense for your group. There are a variety of ways to do that. One way is to have kind of brief but meaningful check-ins at the beginning of meetings. Many of the community groups I work with have adopted this as a standard part of their practice. They set aside the first 10 minutes of the meeting to give every person a chance to share something about their life. Usually these are not work specific, but are things like, what's been on your mind lately? Or what's one thing that gives you hope right now? Or some other question that allows people to share something meaningful. Now, this has to be genuine. It's not just a, how's everybody doing? Fine? Great, okay, let's get going, right? If it's that way, don't even bother because that's not going to work. It's not going to be real. It has to be genuine. It's also important to have kind of a general limit of time on this. It's a brief thing just to kind of ground the conversation. It's not going to take over the entire meeting. So the purpose of this check-in is to just maintain relationships and allow people to connect with each other on something meaningful that isn't work. Now, not all groups will want to do a check-in, and that's totally fine. It might not be right for your group. You can make decisions about that as the leader, decide whether this is something that your group would find meaningful or if they would just find it frustrating, right? So another way to build relationships is for the leader to reach out individually outside of meetings. Check on people, see how they're doing personally and emotionally. Emails, phone calls, texts can always be good for a quick personal check-in. Again, you know better than I do what's going to work best for your group. But the point is to allow people to have some genuine aspect of themselves that they bring to the work. Leaders should also make extra efforts to acknowledge people. This is really important in online settings because we don't have that sort of momentary face-to-face, hey, good job on that report or something, right? So making places to publicly acknowledge and thank people for their work. Maybe that's a weekly announcement of good news. Maybe this is something in a meeting itself that you say, hey, thank you for this. But these kinds of positive feedback on people's work in a public setting can be helpful for maintaining relationships in teams. It's especially important in online spaces because people can feel kind of distant and isolated. And then finally, Because of our specific situation during this pandemic, where everybody's home, families are home, schools are canceled, all these things, leaders should recognize people are stressed. And what it means to work from home can vary greatly for different members of your team. For some, working at home is quiet, productive, and peaceful. For others, it is chaotic, stressful, and filled with competing demands. So to lead an effective team in this situation means recognizing that not everyone has the same schedule, not everyone has the same circumstance. It helps to openly acknowledge this to the group without putting anyone on the spot. But even saying something like, I know many of us have challenging situations and a lot going on at home is helpful. Along with this, leaders need to be patient, have flexibility with timelines if possible, and recognize there might be interruptions during team meetings. So people are the most important. The second key to effective teamwork online has to do with selecting the most appropriate technological tool. Now, it's not always important to have the newest, shiniest, most advanced technology. People get caught up with that a lot, and there are definitely advantages to certain kind of real-time video conferencing that allow for multiple platforms, but that doesn't have to be your go-to every time. So one question a leader should ask is, of the technologies available to us, what tool is the best for this specific task we need to accomplish right now? So here's a few considerations. Do you need to talk in real time? Many of us are used to doing work during meetings, right? Our default assumption is that we need to keep meeting to do that online. So we fill our day with hours of virtual meetings, and that can be exhausting. So sometimes it is important for a team to talk in real time, but that's not always the case. For example, if you find that your meetings are largely around sharing information, like people giving reports, that's probably not, a virtual meeting is not the best format for that. Things like announcements, updates, reports, those are usually one-way communication. Most of the time they don't require us to be in a virtual meeting. It would be more effective to share those updates in another way that allows people to read them individually. This might mean email, or it might mean updating files to some sort of shared drive so people can read and comment on them on their own time. For more complex tasks, like discussing big picture ideas, weighing options, making complex decisions, then you need a more complicated tool, like a web-based video meeting or a conference call, right? These are tasks that really require the back and forth of conversation and collaboration. So what happens when we just use video meetings for one-way communication? People get disengaged. It's so easy in a virtual meeting to put your device on mute, stop paying attention, stop being engaged, right? So to keep people engaged, use the real-time meetings only for things that really require discussion, not being passive listeners. So teams also need to consider what technology is reasonably available and usable for your team. This is especially important for folks like myself who live in rural areas where internet access can be unstable, right? Ideally, whatever tool you decide to use will be flexible enough that people can access it on a variety of devices in a variety of circumstances. And even better, it would be allowing for documents to be viewed offline in times when internet isn't available. So people, which tool to use, and then the third aspect of successful online teams is a commitment to ongoing learning. So effective teams are constantly growing and learning. They're not stagnant. And this does not happen, it doesn't happen automatically. It needs to be intentional. So what are some ways that you can kind of help your team engage in effective ongoing learning? First, build some time in for reflection. Effective teams ask themselves, what's working? What's not working as well as it should? What's shifted since our last conversation, our last meeting? How is this task or this project changing? What should we be doing better? How can we better prepare for challenges that lie ahead? These are important questions that can help your team think critically about its own practices, its own actions, and try to be creative and innovative to think about what we could do better. For some groups, these reflections can happen at the end of meetings or at the end of some meetings if you build it in as part of your regular work. Again, some of the community groups that I work with, they have this sort of reflection as an ongoing part of what they do. Or you can engage in reflection in other forms, like smaller group meetings or asking for individual reflections, kind of written reflections that then are compiled, right? This sort of feedback about what are we learning. Whatever format you use, reflections should allow you to consider what you're learning about the team, what you're learning about the tasks or the projects, and what you're learning about the technologies that you're using. Another thing about learning is you need to capture what you're learning and doing. In face-to-face meetings, many groups take minutes, right? Or some sort of notes that help describe the discussion, decisions that were made, next steps, and so on. We need to keep doing that for online discussions. I can't tell you how many sort of virtual meetings I've been in where at the end of it, it's hard for people to remember what actually happened and what was actually decided. In some ways, it's even more important here because people can miss virtual meetings or you can miss certain parts of it, have multiple things going on. We can't just assume everyone will remember the meeting in the same way and will know and be able to take action on what was discussed. So one way to do this is through collaborative note-taking in an online document that's visible to everyone during the meeting and can be edited in real time. Groups I've participated in that use this often have like one or two people who do the main note-taking, but others can add in clarifications or questions that come up during meetings. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are multiple channels for capturing and sharing what the team is doing. So for some virtual online meeting spaces, there are these chats, right? And conversations can happen there, which is great, but that doesn't necessarily link to the document where your notes are. So having somebody delegated to make sure that that information ends up in the notes can be really helpful. And of course, at some point, teams need to look back at those notes, right, and reflect on the big picture. So after meetings are done, teams should make sure to keep the notes and other project documents in shareable folders so that everyone can have access to them and you can actually reflect on your reflections and see what it is that you've been learning as you go. So these big picture reflections don't have to be built into every meeting, of course, but it's important to make sure the ongoing learning is recorded in some way and organized and accessible. So in summary, effective teams that work online intentionally build good relationships and supportive climate for their group. They are mindful to use technological tools that fit the needs of their work, and they have clear commitment to continuous learning and reflection. Hopefully the tips provided here today can help you and your team develop in these areas and be successful in these challenging times.